A gated community, mid-morning. Sunlight bouncing off a row of luxury SUVs parked along a manicured street. And in the middle of it, a woman in designer sunglasses is standing inches from a police officer, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "Do you have any idea who my husband is?" she says, her voice sharp enough to carry across 3 lawns. One phone call. That's all it takes. One phone call and you're writing parking tickets in a different county by Monday. Beside her, a man in a crisp pink polo shirt stands with his arms crossed, nodding along like her threat is simply a statement of fact. Like it's already settled. The officer doesn't flinch. He doesn't reach for his radio, doesn't raise his voice. He simply says, "Ma'am, I'd encourage you to make that call. But right now, I need you to step back." She doesn't. If anything, her voice climbs another notch, listing off names: a mayor, a country club board member, a judge she claims to golf with. Neighbors are starting to appear in windows and on porches now, phones already coming up. What none of them know yet, not the woman in the sunglasses, not her husband nodding along beside her, is that in less than half an hour, both of them are going to be standing in the back of a patrol car, in front of the very community they were so sure would always answer to them. How does a couple this confident, this connected, this certain of their own untouchability end up here? To understand that, we have to rewind about 3 weeks to a conversation that, on its surface, was about nothing more than a fence. The neighborhood was the kind of place featured in local magazine spreads. A gated community outside a mid-sized American city, custom homes on half-acre lots, a private clubhouse, and an HOA with a reputation for being unusually strict, even by HOA standards. Richard and Victoria Ashford had lived there for 9 years. Richard ran a successful commercial real estate firm downtown. Victoria sat on 2 charity boards and was, by her own frequent description, very well connected in local political and business circles. They drove matching luxury SUVs, hosted an annual holiday party the whole street talked about, and had over the years developed a quiet but firm belief that the rules other people followed didn't quite apply to them the same way. Next door lived Daniel Cho, a soft-spoken software engineer who'd bought his home 2 years earlier, one of the more modest properties in the community, but entirely within the same HOA, same guidelines, same rights as everyone else on the street. Daniel kept himself, worked mostly from home, and had never once been the subject of a single HOA complaint in the 2 years he'd lived there. That changed a week. He had a new fence installed along his side yard, a fence built entirely on his own property, permitted through the city, and installed by a licensed contractor who'd pulled every required document before a single post went into the ground. The Ashfords didn't like it. Not because it violated any actual rule. It didn't, but because it was 8 inches taller than the fence bordering their own pool area, and from their kitchen window, it slightly changed the view they'd grown used to for 9 years. Victoria raised it at the next HOA meeting, calling it an eyesore that clearly wasn't approved. When the HOA's own compliance officer checked the file and confirmed Daniel's fence had, in fact, been fully approved and permitted, Victoria wasn't satisfied. She decided to handle it herself. That decision is where this story really begins. Victoria showed up at Daniel's front door on a Saturday morning, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, tablet in hand, as if she were carrying official documentation. "This fence needs to come down," she said, without so much as a greeting. "It violates the community's aesthetic guidelines. 6 feet is the maximum, and this is clearly taller than that." Daniel, standing in his doorway in a t-shirt and sweatpants, blinked in surprise. "I actually just got the paperwork back from the HOA office. It's approved. I checked before I even ordered the materials." "Approved by who?" Victoria asked, her tone suggesting the answer couldn't possibly be correct. "Because I sit on enough boards to know how these things work, and I promise you, someone made a mistake." "I can show you the approval letter," Daniel offered, already reaching for his phone to pull it up. "It's dated, signed, everything." Victoria waved a hand, dismissing the offer before he'd even finished the sentence. "I don't need to see a screenshot, Daniel. I know people who actually run this community. This will get sorted out one way or another, and I'd strongly recommend you start looking into contractors who can lower it before that happens the hard way." Daniel kept his voice even. I appreciate you letting me know your concerns, but I followed every step correctly. If there's a real issue, I'm happy to address it through the actual HOA process. There's an easier way to handle this, Victoria said, already turning to leave. But it doesn't sound like you're interested in easier. Daniel chose to stay calm. He thanked her for stopping by, closed the door, and went back to his Saturday. Victoria, walking back across the lawn toward her own house, was already pulling out her phone. By Monday afternoon, Daniel had a notice in his inbox from the HOA, not from the compliance office he'd already worked with, but a new complaint filed directly by a board member, requesting an emergency review of his unauthorized structure. The notice cited a possible fine of $500 per week the fence remained standing. Daniel called the HOA office directly. The same compliance officer who'd approved his permit in the first place picked up, sounding almost apologetic. She confirmed again that his fence was fully compliant and legally approved, but explained that under the community's bylaws, any board member could request a review, which would take a few business days to formally close out, even if the outcome was already clear. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Richard got involved next. He stopped Daniel in the driveway that same evening, his tone friendlier than his wife's, but no less pointed. "Look, I'm sure this is all a big misunderstanding," Richard said, hands in his pockets, projecting casual confidence. "But Victoria's not going to let this go, and honestly, it'd save everyone a headache if you just brought the fence down a few inches voluntarily. I know a guy who could have it done by Thursday, no charge to you." "I appreciate that," Daniel said, "but I already went through the proper process. I'd rather not modify something that's fully approved just because it's inconvenient for someone else's view." Richard's smile thinned slightly. "You know Victoria's on a first-name basis with half the county commission, right? This can go a lot of different ways. I'm just trying to make it the easy way. Does this sound like a neighbor trying to solve a disagreement? Or does this sound like someone using their connections as leverage to get their way regardless of who's actually right? Is that a misunderstanding? Or is that a power trip dressed up as friendly advice?" Over the next several days, the pressure kept building. Anonymous complaints started appearing about Daniel's trash cans, his lawn height, even his work-from-home car being parked in his own driveway during business hours. None of it held up under review. All of it took time, patience, and a growing folder of documentation Daniel was now carefully keeping, just in case. One evening, a different neighbor, a retired teacher named Susan who lived across the street, stopped Daniel while he was checking his mail. "I heard what's been going on," she said quietly. "For what it's worth, that fence looks exactly like everyone else's back there. I don't know what she's so worked up about." Daniel thanked her, appreciating that at least someone on the street could see the situation clearly, even if it didn't change anything happening behind the scenes. By the following week, the formal review had closed. The HOA's official written decision confirmed, once again, that Daniel's fence was fully compliant, properly permitted, and would not be subject to any fine or forced modification. For a few days, things went quiet. No new complaints appeared. No notices showed up in Daniel's inbox. He mowed his lawn on Saturday like normal, waved to a couple of neighbors walking by, and allowed himself to believe the whole situation had simply run its course. But he kept every document anyway: the approval letter, the review decision, the string of dismissed complaints, organized in a folder on his desk. Something about how quickly and confidently Victoria had dismissed actual paperwork made him not quite ready to relax completely. He was right not to, because 2 houses down, behind tinted windows and a closed front door, Victoria wasn't done. She'd spent that quiet week not accepting the outcome, but convincing herself that the HOA's decision was simply wrong, that somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way to make this go the way she'd already decided it should. The following Tuesday morning, a single patrol car pulled slowly through the gated entrance and up to Daniel's driveway. Victoria had called it in herself about 15 minutes earlier, telling the dispatcher that a neighbor had threatened her during a property dispute and was refusing to comply with HOA legal orders. None of that was true. Daniel had never raised his voice to her, never threatened anything, and had spent the entire dispute simply pointing to paperwork. But the responding officer, Officer Halden, had no way of knowing that yet A threat allegation is something that has to be taken seriously every time, regardless of the neighborhood. Officer Halden approached Daniel first, calm and professional, explaining the nature of the complaint. Daniel, though clearly rattled by the word threatened, stayed composed and immediately offered to walk the officer through the entire situation from the beginning. That's when Victoria appeared on her own front lawn, Richard trailing a step behind her. Both dressed like they were headed somewhere far more important than a Tuesday morning conversation with a police officer. Finally, Victoria said, walking briskly toward them. "Officer, I want this handled today. This man has been harassing us for weeks over a structure that clearly violates community standards, and frankly, given who we are in this community, I'd expect a bit more urgency." Officer Halden's tone stayed level. "Ma'am, I need to hear both sides and look at whatever documentation exists before anything gets handled. Who someone is in the community doesn't change that process." Richard chimed in, arms crossed. "You might want to double-check who you're talking to before this conversation goes any further." By now, 3 or 4 neighbors had come out onto their porches, watching quietly, phones slowly rising. Susan, the retired teacher from across the street, stood at the edge of her lawn with her arms folded, watching the scene with an expression that suggested none of this surprised her in the slightest. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to. Have you ever seen someone actually try to use their social standing as leverage with a police officer in real time, expecting it to change how the situation gets handled? It happens more often than people think, and it almost never goes the way the person hoping to use it expects it to. Daniel walked calmly into his house and returned less than a minute later with a folder. The fence permit, the HOA's original approval letter, the formal written decision closing out Victoria's complaint, and a printed log of every dismissed follow-up complaint filed against him over the past 2 weeks. He handed the whole thing to Officer Halden without a word, letting the paperwork speak for itself. Officer Halden read through it methodically, page by page, while Victoria stood there, arms crossed, visibly impatient. "This is a lot of paperwork for something that should have been resolved weeks ago," she said. "I don't understand why this is even still a conversation. It says here the HOA fully closed this out in writing over a week ago," Officer Halden said, looking up. "Were you aware of that decision, ma'am?" There was a pause, the first real hesitation from Victoria in this entire story. Yes, I was aware of it. I simply don't agree with it." "Disagreeing with a decision isn't the same as it being unresolved," Officer Halden said, still even-toned. "And based on what I'm seeing here, along with the fact that no threat appears to have actually occurred, I have some concerns about the report that brought me out here this morning." Richard's confident posture faltered slightly. "Now hold on. That's not. She may have used strong language on the phone, but that's not the same as." "I understand," Officer Halden said. "I just need to sort out exactly what was reported versus what actually happened here." You could see it settle over both of them. The realization that, for the first time in weeks, none of it was going the direction they'd assumed it would. Because Victoria had knowingly reported a threat that never occurred, in order to compel an urgent police response to a civil property matter that had already been formally resolved, Officer Halden explained, calmly and without theatrics, that filing a false report was a serious matter he was now required to act on. "You're joking," Victoria said, her voice rising for the first time in disbelief rather than authority. "Over a fence? Do you understand who my husband is? I understand you filed a report describing a threat that, based on everything here, didn't happen," Officer Halden said. "That's what I'm required to act on." Richard stepped forward, still trying to recover the tone from earlier. "Officer, surely we can resolve this without." "You're welcome to speak with your attorney," Officer Halden said, not unkindly, but firmly. "That's exactly the process for this." There was no shouting from the officer, no dramatics, no raised voice to match theirs, just a calm, procedural process, exactly the way it's meant to work, regardless of who happens to be standing on which side of the conversation. The neighbors on their porches stayed quiet through all of it. Daniel stood off to the side, saying nothing, not smiling, not gloating, just watching a situation resolve itself the way it should have from the very first conversation at his front door. Did Victoria and Richard expect this outcome when she picked up the phone that morning? Certain that a single call would settle things in their favor? Almost certainly not. People who've spent years assuming their name or their status changes how situations unfold rarely plan for the moment. It simply doesn't. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board reviewed the entire pattern of complaints filed against Daniel's property, alongside the police report Victoria had filed. The board issued a formal notice reminding all residents that HOA disputes were to be handled exclusively through the established review process, not through pressure, and not through emergency calls to law enforcement. Daniel never asked for any of this to unfold the way it did. He didn't post about it in the community app, didn't bring it up at the next HOA meeting. And when a neighbor asked him about it later, he mostly just shrugged and said he was glad it was finally over. He simply wanted his fence, the one he'd properly permitted, properly built, and properly defended with nothing but patience and paperwork, left alone. In the end, that's exactly what happened. At the end of the day, this was never really a story about 8 inches of fence height. It was about what happens when two people spend so long believing their name, their status, or their connections would always tip situations in their favor. And what happens eventually, when the facts simply don't care who's asking. Daniel didn't win this by fighting louder or pulling strings of his own. He won it by staying calm, keeping his documentation, and letting the truth hold up under pressure when it mattered most. Sometimes that really is all it takes. If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you want more real HOA and neighbor karma stories like this one every week. There are plenty more where this came from. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought their money or their connections meant the rules simply didn't apply to them? Tell us what happened in the comments below. We genuinely read every one of them.